Hi everybody, and welcome to this afternoon's expert talk. I shall start on that basis and start talking, not from the position of maybe an expert, but I'm going to start talking and introduce myself as the host, facilitator today. My name is Ant Welsh, and I'll be introducing the four expert speakers we've got this afternoon and coordinating any questions that you might want to table. I will point out that the meeting is being recorded as of this point. Hopefully you'll be notified when you come into the meeting, but just to be clear, so it's on the recording, everyone is being recorded from this point onwards. We'll just pause just for a few moments because we are ahead of the start point of the scheduled start point of 4 o'clock. So we'll give it a couple of minutes for everyone to come in. We're delighted to let you know that we have got a maximum participant registration today. So we are considering there may be well up to 1,000 people in the meeting. So with that in mind, obviously the mute function is on, the camera function is disabled, I should say, in that everybody is off, and we've got the Q&A option within this Zoom meeting today. So we're not opening the chat option for everybody. It could be quite a challenge to manage 1,000 of you all contributing positively, I'm sure, to the chat, but we'll manage that through the Q&A. And then we've got a team of people sitting in the background who will be monitoring that, and we'll be considering any questions that people table as we go through today's session. Each of the four speakers will go in turn, obviously, and we've decided that everyone's going to go one after the other without extensive discussion in between. We might raise a point, perhaps, in between each of the speakers, but we won't have extensive discussion in order to make sure we get through all of the speakers in a timely manner, and then we can open that up then to the speakers to respond to questions in more detail then towards the second half of today's talk. We are looking at 60 to 90 minutes. Everyone has been told it can be up to 90 minutes. We'll see how we go. Of course, we've got approximately 40 minutes worth of speakers to deliver with some introductions as well. So we'll see how we do with the meeting. And but yeah, it could last up to 90 minutes, but at which point then we will end the meeting. So it won't go longer than that point. So we're just pausing as everybody comes in here. Just a reminder then, so I'll repeat myself, apologies for those that joined a bit early, that the meeting is recorded, so as you're coming in to be aware of that. And we're just waiting until we get to 4 o'clock exactly before we move forward. A reminder for those just coming in now that there's the Q&A function throughout this session, and we'll be using that to perhaps make a comment in between speakers briefly if something has come up that we feel should be featured, but otherwise the questions will be asked towards the end of the session after the four speakers have presented. So we're just coming up now to 4 o'clock. My watch is buzzing, telling me that we've hit 4 p.m. So again, I'd like to welcome everybody that's in the room at the moment. We are expecting more attendees, but we will move forward now as we've hit 4 o'clock. I'd like to welcome you officially to this, the first of Best Practice Network's Leadership NPQ Expert Talks, with a specific focus this time on teacher recruitment. I'm sure uppermost on many people's minds in education at the moment. There will be further expert talks throughout your NPQ programme, and those are linked to a relevant theme as part of each cycle. So do look out for those when you get access to all of your content in Canvas, to book in and make sure that you register for future events. Okay then, so without further ado, we'll move on today. And the first of our speakers today is Mark Davis. Mark has recently left his post of Chief Executive of Trust in Learning, Bristol, after 11 years. Trust in Learning is a multi-academy chain which supports 8 academies and 1 trust school. Mark came to Bristol to launch the Bridge Learning Campus, which is one of the first all-through institutions in the UK, encompassing education and learning from ages 3 to 16, prior then to establishing the new trust. Trust in Learning serves mainly schools of very high levels of disadvantage in the city, covering nursery, primary, secondary and specialist provision. And then prior to moving to Bristol, Mark established and ran his own leadership coaching business, as well as establishing a second company on behalf of Gloucestershire schools and university. During this period, he supported a number of failing schools securing improvement. Up until 2006, he was head teacher at Dean Magnus School, Gloucestershire. The school was highly acclaimed both locally and nationally for the quality of education provided, and whilst leading the school, Mark introduced some radical and forward-thinking approaches to education, and the school was judged outstanding and leading edge. Mark has been asked to sit in some prestigious forums to advise the government. Notably, he's been a member of the DfE Head Teachers Reference Group from 2001 until 2017, and was a member of the influential Steer Report. He continues to provide direct support to peers in similar posts, as well as leading the trust previously as a CEO, and now moving forward independently. So, after that introduction, Mark, it's over to you. I'd like to welcome Mark to the room, who's going to talk today on this key point of teacher recruitment in education. Mark, welcome, and over to you.
Thank you, Anthony, and it's a real pleasure, I'm sure, for myself, but also I'm sure my peers who are going to help this discussion this afternoon. I have got a couple of, and I'm sorry if my throat is a little bit odd, but Nantes following Wales at the weekend was a problem. So I'm going to share a couple of my screen in a short while. Hopefully it'll come up. As that's coming up, everybody,
Thanks, Mark.
I think, as Anthony said, the amount of people who's on this call demonstrates, I think, the issues that we're facing in education. And I think, and I always say this because I've got a thing about when we talk about recruitment, and obviously teaching recruitment is hugely problematic, but equally, staff recruitment in its entirety in schools is as problematic. Associate staffing, you know, if we think about the wages that some of our colleagues are being paid, you know, in my view, it's absolutely deplorable. And yet we're fixed with certain costs. And so whilst we're talking about teacher recruitment, I think we also should be thinking about equity around other colleagues in the profession and the difficulty in recruiting people who are in effect supporting the classroom in many different ways. This first slide is, you know, you just have to, this was literally 1 second looking on Google for a few headings around the crisis that we're facing. And ultimately, it is a crisis, and it's a crisis that seems to be getting worse. And just as a prelude to this, I think it can be really quite depressing. And I'm hoping that within 5 minutes or so, I can actually sort of suggest maybe some other ways of thinking about recruitment. So whilst it is, and if we move on to the next slide, please, Becky, that'd be good. And just keep pressing for a few minutes. It is ultimately a perfect storm, and the perfect storm, in my view, in terms of what recruitment is all about at the moment, is that fewer people are actually attracted to the profession. That statement in itself is well, it's extremely worrying. As a sideline, I chair a skit program, and it's one of the largest in the west and southwest of England. I chair the board. This year, we're about 70% down in primary, secondary teaching, people who want to come into the profession. So there's three things that are problematic here. Fewer people coming in, more people in their early to mid years leaving, and equally experienced people leaving or retiring from the profession. So it is a perfect storm. You can click on to the next one, please. That would be good. And this is my last slide, so I'm going to really read through this. So if it is a perfect storm, when we talk about teacher recruitment, we generally talk about a sort of three-cornered school of reward, retention, and recruitment. And those three things are fundamentally important to consider and also to plan for, as I'm sure everybody in this call would know, given the experience on it. So if we just click one more, and I'll talk a little bit about reward. Reward, you know, I hate to say it, but we fail to realise or think about the issue of pay as much as I think we should do. Whilst we're hamstrung to some extent around pay, there's something, I don't know, there's something in the profession that makes us not want to talk about pay. And actually, we should be talking about pay. We should be talking about that as being ultimate a reward for people doing a piece of work. And yet for many years, we've sort of been a bit as if it's sort of not morally good sound to talk about pay, but people are working, and we need to sort of consider, and I think the government and whoever, needs to consider how the future of pay and paying conditions in teaching is actually funded. So I don't think we should just ignore that. I think it's fundamentally part of the issues that we have to face with. But reward is also about opportunity and fulfillment. Opportunity to to contribute, to do the things that we know teaching and staff want to do, to contribute to young people's lives, whether they're in early years or post-16 or whatever. So the opportunity to contribute is absolutely fundamental to how I think, as we try to reward people and get them in, is thinking about how you create a culture that is about fulfillment, about understanding the purpose and the outcome that you as a teacher can make for young people. And that's quite often, I think we sometimes forget that. But fundamentally, if we want to get a culture that is about opportunity and fulfillment, and a teacher who wants to stay in a profession, it's also about the next slide, which is retention. So if you just click on that one slightly. And that retention, I put culture there as well. We talk about addressing workload, don't we? Fundamentally, I remember Ant talked about me working at a school in Gloucestershire, D Magna, in late 1900s and early 2000s. And I started that headship by saying the biggest problem in teaching and learning is the 6 inches of the width of the wall between one teacher and another. And I'm flabbergasted that we haven't really fundamentally understood how collaboration between teachers can fundamentally alter and improve workload. I still think we are well behind where we should be on that. And that was 20 years ago, and we keep talking about, how teachers collaborate. And with the emergence of trusts and networks of schools, whatever they are, whether they're multi-academy trusts or other types of networks, anything that is about a family of schools should be in a position to further collaborate in terms of curriculum development, in terms of pedagogy. And if you get that right, in my view, that helps to address workload, but also provides that fulfillment and opportunity that comes with the reward of the job. But there is also another issue, and I think potentially post-COVID, and I've been to a number of schools recently since this term, and schools that behaviour-wise have not had issues recently, they are. And it's the behaviour, when you're a teacher, if you're a teacher in the front line and the behaviour and the culture of the school is problematic, that in itself adds to the workload tremendously. It adds to the pressure, it adds to the concern, it adds to all of those personal things that we as employers should be there to support with. And so I firmly believe that unless you get the culture right in terms of behaviour, the workload increases tremendously. And so it's on our side as leaders to think about how you create the culture within the school or within a trust or within whatever you're working with that supports collaboration, but also fundamentally gets grips with behaviour, so that the culture in the school is one in which people want to be there and they want to go home and say to their loved one or their children, I had a bloody good day, and it was a day that I felt fulfilled because I was doing something. That in itself was something that is rich in its intensity in terms of how people should be thinking as a teacher or a member of staff in the school. And yet if they're faced with blockages every day, obstacles in terms of behaviour, in terms of the wrong or negative culture in the school, that in itself undermines that sort of retention and ultimately people do want to leave. I put another point in there, which is reframing our understanding of the word vocation. And I know this may not go down well with a lot of people here, or it may do, I don't know. What I mean by that is, I did 42 years in education. I'm still doing a bit in education. And to me, it was a vocation. And for many years, I'd sit there as a head teacher or a CEO and say, you know, what's happened to people? They're not seeing it as a vocation anymore. Yeah, but that's fundamentally because things have changed. And I think as senior leaders and leaders, we need to reframe what we really mean by the word vocation. It doesn't necessarily mean 42 years. It may mean 5 or 6 years. So I absolutely see that what we should be doing really in terms of retaining teachers, it could be for a fixed term contract for a period of time, so that people do have a number of journeys in their life. It may not be just a journey in education. I'm not saying that if you do have that vocational instinct about being, I want my whole life in education, fine. But there's a lot of people, as we know, 56% of people at the moment within 5 years are looking to leave. So we need to tackle that and understand why they're leaving. Is it about workload, or is it that they just want a number of those journeys in their job, in their career? And it may not be, as I say, just fundamentally in education. And so if that is the case, why don't we start to look at different type of contractual arrangements and offer those in order to be attractive to people? And the last thing I wanted to talk about is recruitment in terms of how we do that. And I put that there, realizing the impact of social media because of one thing. So in the trust that I was recently left, you know, it's the highest percentage of free school meals disadvantage in the whole of the Southwest, one of the highest in the country. You know, averaging 60%. Very, very disadvantaged communities. And recruitment in a number of the schools has been very challenging. Where we've been successful is not thinking about a job, but thinking about people coming into the trust rather than a particular job, i.e. a social media campaign that doesn't target people who want to get another job. It targets the people who are actually happy in where they are. Now, I know that's a problem because you're in effect, in the old days, you'd call that poaching, really. But what we did, and we did it on 5 separate occasions across the trust, we had opportunities to just come in post-school. And in Bristol, we had in 3 of those, we had over 50 people who'd been basically had emails and social media contact asking if they were interested in coming to talk about what we do as Trust in Learning and the culture we have in the trust. And actually 80% of those people weren't looking actively for jobs. So I think there are particular ways that you could look at recruitment and see it in a different way, rather than saying, we've got a vacancy, let's go out to an advert. There are other ways that potentially you can sort of look at getting people to maybe join a family of schools or a school. You can do this as an individual school if you really wanted to. The funny thing about it, everybody, if I said this to myself 10 years ago, I would be looking at myself internally saying, is that the right thing to do for the profession? Is it? I'm not sure, but it certainly was the right thing to do for our trust at the time. So I do think that targeting approach for recruitment, specific recruitment strategies, is potentially a way forward and gives an opportunity for people to see recruitment and leadership in a different way in terms of HR and people. So I suppose what I'm saying really is, whilst it is massively difficult at the moment, and I think going to be increasingly so over the next maybe 10 years, the things that the commonality between these 3 things here are culture, culture, culture. If we get the culture right in the schools, in terms of the things I've been mentioning, you can get an opportunity for people to be invested in children, invested in young people. And there's always going to be people who are going to be invested in young people, but it doesn't matter, in my view, if it's only for 5 or 6 years or 7 years. It may be that that's what we need to think about in terms of differences, in terms of how we see the actual life of the career of a teacher, or a career of a person investing in education. And it could be that they do 5, 6, 7 years, they go and do something else and come back. But I do think we can't just sit on a traditional way of looking at recruitment, looking at retention. We need to be much more radical and in terms of how we see that. So that's my tooth penneth. I hope there's a few things in there that would resonate with some people. I hope I haven't upset too many people, particularly around that word vocation, because I understand the sensitivities around what I'm saying in terms of that. But I do think I've got two children, right? They're late 20s, and they are looking for jobs that are short term, like 5-6 years and another job. And I just think we need to realize that, and can't think that actually the traditional models of recruitment, retention, and reward in education are going to be the things that are going to go forward in the future. We need to do something differently. And as leaders, I think the onus is on us to consider radical approaches, consider strategies that are different to what it's been in the past. Thank you.
Yeah, lovely. Thank you, Mark. Yeah, interesting though, where there are lots of traction being gained. So what you were mentioning about the cases, of course, and that's what this is about. It's where we're provoking discussion. That's the point here. It's interesting to get differing viewpoints, fascinating. So just some immediate feedback, Mark, we're getting certainly that reframing of the term vocation is being welcomed. A lot of comments coming in about that, and then interesting some alternative comments saying, do you think there is a will? Not to be answered now necessarily, but to kind of consider, is there a will within education and leadership teams to do something radical and take that on board? That's an interesting point, I think, that could be discussed. And also your other point about culture, I've written that down so many times here. This and that. That's I agree there. That it reminds me always of the Drucker quote. Peter Drucker's quote, "Culture eats strategy for breakfast." That quote comes up, and the NPQ participants will be looking at that. Actually, a really interesting sort of amuse-bouche going into the NPQ program, because that is a theme throughout the leaders NPQ. That idea of you can have all the strategy in the world, but if the culture isn't essentially there, so lots to think about. Comments about why are people so disaffected with teaching, obviously linking into that as well, and workload. So really interesting start. Thank you and for going first as well, Mark. Really appreciate that, being first out of the blocks. So interesting, and we just like to remind everybody as we move into our second expert talk today by Evelyn Ford. The Q&A function is there. It has been building, certainly. I made a note earlier to say, please do keep those comments coming in, because the team in the background is working to compile all of those. And it doesn't matter how many times people say the same thing, the team will merge those into questions that we can table later. So again, thank you very much, Mark. And we move now to Evelyn. So Evelyn Ford is a senior school leader since 2008 and head teacher since 2015. Evelyn is a regular contributor to the broader national educational debates as a conference speaker, committee member and writer. She won the TES Head Teacher of the Year Award in 2020 and was the National President of the Association of School and College Leaders 2022 to 2023. Her services to education were recognised in the 2021 New Year's Honours List. In August 2023, Evelyn stepped down from a headship role and is currently undertaking a number of consultancy roles in the education sector, and is also a trustee for Education Support, a charity which promotes the well-being of staff in schools. So Evelyn, I'd like to welcome you to today's expert talk and invite you to present your thoughts.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Mark, for your passion and for kicking us off. And I think what participants are going to find is that all of us are going to build on many of the themes that Mark has started with. And I don't want it to be all doom and gloom, but I don't think we can ignore the gravitas of the situation. I just don't think it can be underestimated in terms of the challenges that school leaders are finding in terms of recruitment. I think that post-pandemic, I really think that many people have kind of rethought their lives and their career options and are looking for flexibility and looking for a better work-life balance, which talks to the point that Mark raised around workload. So I just think that, you know, this time last year at the Conservative Party conference, I spoke about a perfect storm. You know, Mark talks about sleepwalking into, but we're actually at this crisis now. And I did a bit of research as well, just to kind of share some stats with the participants. And Teacher Tap produced a report which showed that job adverts had increased by 12% last year, and that a record-breaking 13% of secondary schools reported unfilled vacancies. And I can talk to that as a, you know, previous serving head teacher around how really challenging it was to fill those spots. And sometimes it really felt like, you know, when you're in the football season and you're negotiating your players, I'm not a footballer, but there is a word for it. And sometimes it did begin to feel like we were kind of negotiating to try and get teachers to come to our schools. The system shouldn't be like that. So that's where it's also gone slightly wrong. We also know that many subjects are being taught by non-specialists. That is, I think that's a growing issue, and the young people that will be most affected by the recruitment and retention crisis will undoubtedly be your under-resourced young people. I've stopped referring to them as disadvantaged. I now refer to them as under-resourced, and they will not have the resources that they need at home because of their circumstances. Teacher Tap also showed some data which said only 59% of teachers now expect to be in teaching in the next 3 years. So that, you know, that kind of longevity, and as Mark spoke to about a vocation, you know, yeah, I totally agree, Mark, that we should kind of reframe that it's okay to stay for a certain period of time. But I think the stats from Teacher Tap talk to, unless things change in the profession, people are looking for a way out, and that cannot be good. So those are some stats from Teacher Tap, and I was fortunate enough to chair a commission by Education Support and Public First. And what we found was, and this quote that's in our report, if you solve the retention issue, you will resolve the recruitment issue. And our findings included the fact that the expectations on staff beyond teaching in the classroom is a real driver for the retention and the recruitment crisis. 39% of people surveyed for our report felt that they were not prepared for supporting vulnerable pupils and their families. 34% were not prepared for dealing with some real challenging pupil behaviour. And indeed, as ASCL president last year, I often spoke about schools becoming the fourth emergency service. And by that, it just feels like all the other services, you know, are crashing, and so they're sending it all through to schools. And most recently, there was something about, you know, teachers should be helping young people to brush their teeth. Now, you know, we can have a long debate about that, but that's just one example of, oh, so let's just give that to schools to do. And actually, that's leading to a recruitment and retention crisis. And I know that when I qualified many moons ago as a history teacher, you know, I wanted to teach history. I was passionate about my subject. Of course, you know, the tutor role and the pastoral role, I knew that went hand in hand. But actually, things have just kind of grown and grown and grown, so much so that, you know, teachers on the front line are dealing with some real mental health challenges in our young people. And even as a school leader, sometimes I didn't feel qualified enough. I didn't know how to talk a young person down. And I just think that the weight of responsibility on teachers and leaders in terms of that fourth emergency service, I think that's adding another dimension to the recruitment crisis. In our commission, we found that school leaders reported working on an average of 56.8 hours a week, and teachers reported working 48.7 hours a week. And when you layer that with the draconian accountability measures, it is just not sustainable. So all the things I've just mentioned kind of talk to why people in the profession are either now rethinking, is this for me? Has the love of teaching and the passion gone out of it because of everything that's being asked of us? Now, my own experiences as a recent head teacher, you know, last year I had 4 unfilled science vacancies all year, just could not fill those vacancies. The impact on consistency, the impact on outcomes, you know, Mark spoke about behaviour. If you haven't got that consistent, invested teacher in front of you, it makes a job so much harder. So my 4 unfilled science vacancies, add that to 3 long-term supply staff in 3 other subjects, all of this means it's a real challenge to retain those high standards, and it does become really stressful. I've already spoken about, you know, the transfer window where you put an ad out. Totally agree. Let's think about how we are advertising, where we are advertising. But unless everybody in the profession is on the same page as us, I still think we'll get some school leaders who can afford it, don't know how, who can afford to whack on a TLR or whack on an R&R to get those teachers. But other schools and other, you know, school leaders don't have that money. So I just think that we need to think about how we are recruiting. The other thing about recruitment window, which I found, is that we used to have 3 kind of recruitment windows. You know, you knew that, you know, the end of term, you're getting ready for the next term. Now it's 1 continuous open recruitment window. And I don't think that can be good for morale or stability of a school. I also found that, and it wasn't just my school, that there were teachers who were resigning outside of resignation windows, or indeed just not turning up at the start of term, you know, got a better offer. And whilst, yes, we are bound by school teachers' pay and conditions, to actually take somebody to a tribunal for not turning up on the day or resigning out of the resignation window, again, that is adding to the stress of school leadership and for teachers. I think the mental health of staff due to the pressure in schools is also leading to long-term absences, which is also leading to potentially people rethinking their futures. One head teacher I'm supporting now, you know, post-August, she told me that she had 12 applications for a science job, but only 1 of those applications was based in the UK. Now, it's not an issue if you have the mechanism for sponsorship, but that's not always straightforward. And again, it's just adding to the challenges that we find ourselves in. So where are the successes? The research will show that primary recruitment is marginally better than secondary. I think the hard-fought pay increase was a step in the right direction, but we now realise they got their figures wrong. So it means that the amount that we're going to receive into schools will mean that head teachers will have to redraw their budgets for 2024-25. So just thinking about some recommendations, and the NFER also did a report, and they've got some recommendations which, you know, are asking the government to develop a long-term strategy for improving the competitiveness of teacher pay in relation to other occupations. And I will echo what Mark said, it's not just about teachers, it's about associate staff as well. They are the backbone of our schools, and unless we pay them well, they will go and get a job somewhere else. They will go and work in Lidl or Aldi or somewhere else because the pay and potentially conditions are better. NFER is also recommending the government should fund further research to better understand teachers' flexible working preferences. And again, I think that is a key issue that that we need to look at in our schools. And I also think, a pie in the sky, I don't know, but I think that the government should revisit Kevin Collins' recovery plan with a lens on mental health and well-being, the support not just for students, but for staff too. I don't think you can underestimate the legacy of COVID on the mental health and well-being of young people and staff. And finally, I think that the government should hail education as the marvel that it is, that the amazing profession that it is, rather than us being told that we are sitting on our backsides and only education ministers are doing all the hard work. That is not true. And I just think that if we get a different government, I just think that we need to celebrate this wonderful, wonderful profession so that people will think that's somewhere where I want to go. That's a vocation. That's somewhere where I want to invest some time to meet the needs of young people and have fun. Have fun delivering your passion, your subject, because right now it is all feeling just a little bit challenging. Thank you.
Lovely, thank you very much. Yes, I'm not sure if we've got the little reactions thing in here to put all those little clapping hands in. I always love those emojis. Yeah, no, thank you, Evelyn. Really interesting words there. Certainly some commonalities, some themes that are emerging between the speakers, some interesting then differences of opinion, which is interesting. We can have that discussed later, which is always good, and the purpose of a debate of this nature, and certainly at this level. Where obviously the participants can't see all of the Q&A of all of each other's because it would just be too all over the shop with so many participants. But some themes that are emerging in the background, my colleagues, thank you, are feeding through some of the themes, particularly around financial constraint coming through as a theme, which have an impact on staff numbers, etc. And then a subsequent impact that was commented upon in terms of quality of staff attracted then as a result of that. So going on again, your point there about solve the retention issue, and then we're solving the recruitment issue, even an interesting point there that links. School culture coming out again and again, and that sort of feeling of what do people gain, what do they experience in their work? Is it fun? Is it enjoyable? Is it rewarding? And I think it's really interesting to point out both emotionally and financially. I think it is important to point out that it should be a financially rewarding job as much as it is this idea of vocation, and that is coming through very strongly as a theme as well. Really positive reaction or a strong reaction. We'll have to wait and see what the comments are, even to your fourth emergency service comment. I wondered how that would land because the AA claimed that for quite a while, didn't it? And in teaching context, I think that's a really interesting point. Yes, we're even teaching how to brush teeth, etc. So for the benefit of the participants in the background, like I said, who can't see these, there was some thought on inspiring our teachers, again, to love teaching. And I think, again, that point that resonates with your point there, even about if there's a change in government or we go red, blue, blue, red, back and forth. Yes, making it that it's a vocation, it is a job that is attractive, that you will enjoy, will be rewarding, will be challenging, etc. And then an interesting point, perhaps to consider, we might come back to this later. You commented there was a question come up about the difference between recruitment potentially in primary and secondary, and could there be something to be learned from each other in that, possibly also considering the kind of multifaceted education system we have now of foundation, cooperatives, trusts, small trusts, large trusts. Is there something to be learned from these settings? Perhaps that could be something we might consider later. And then there was some traction for pupil behaviour as well, in terms of, I see that perhaps on a more wider scale, in terms of a community scale, in terms of how much that does have an impact on teacher recruitment and well-being, etc. So lots to consider there. And thank you again, Evelyn, for, as always, a really interesting presentation. So we're going to move on now and remind everybody to keep those comments coming through the Q&A. They are going off the chart here. We've got 87 at the moment, I can see in the background, that our team are working to respond to. So we're going to move on now to our third speaker, and that's Will. Will Smith is Chief Executive Officer at the Greenshaw Learning Trust, having previously been a successful head teacher. He led the Pixel network for a number of years, and more recently is the inspiration behind the growing collaborative By Leaders for Leaders. Will regularly speaks at educational events, and as well as an established executive coach, is a father to 3 children who are his primary source of inspiration. So I'd like to invite Will now to join us at this expert talk today and share your views on teacher recruitment. Will, welcome.
Thank you, and it's really good to be here with everybody. And normally when we do these, and I've done a few now with Evelyn, I'm the warm-up act for Evelyn, which is exactly how it should be. So we got this the wrong way round, Evelyn, but we'll give it a go. Some thoughts to share with you. So I'm responsible for, I think in the 1st of November it'll be 32 primary and secondary schools across the south of England. And I suppose I'd like to be able to say to you, we've cracked this. Recruitment is not an issue in our organisation, or retention. We get loads of applications for all the jobs that we want. We've got a pool of people ready to go, and we're firing on all cylinders. Some of that's true, but not all of it. There's no doubt about that. I was reflecting, and what I wanted to say to you in the sort of 10 minutes that I've got, and I suppose it aligns to a certain extent with some of the messages that have already been given. It's about 2 things: how we attract and keep people in the profession on a broader national/international perspective, and then how do you attract and keep people in your organisation. And I was kind of thinking, who are you? Who are the 700 odd people that we've got on the call? Well, you are the future leaders of our schools. You are the people who are going to be sitting on this call doing this talk in a few years' time, talking about the organizations that you lead, the mats that you lead, etc., etc. And so I suppose I'm coming at it from a leadership perspective, but pretty much everything I've got to say applies, I think, at every level within education, and also not just in teaching. So I kind of have this theory that if and I've heard this said by a number of people, if you really enjoy doing what you're doing, if you're really good at it and you feel like you're really making a difference, and indeed you are, and if what you're doing pays the bills, then largely, and there's some kind of Venn diagram that comes together here, if you're in the middle of that, where you hit all 3 of those things, you enjoy it, you're good at it, making a difference, and you pay the bills, one could argue that you're being successful. And I would argue that there's a pretty good fighting chance of us retaining you in the profession. So let's just unpick those for just a couple of minutes. So pay the bills. Most educational organisations, on a short-term, immediate basis, that is out of our control. So most organisations like mine subscribe and commit to, and rightly so, teachers' paying conditions. And so most of the conversations around payments, other than the small discretionary payments we may give, and I'm actually not an advocate for recruitment and retention payments, because I think they're divisive, and as a chief executive of an organisation with 2,000 employees, they can be quite divisive and very tricky to manage. But that's a separate issue. They are largely down to national negotiations on an annual basis, and we don't really have a say. We sort of have a say, don't we? Once every 5 years, we might get one next year, and obviously through, and I'm a massive advocate for the work of our unions, through negotiations with unions. But largely on a day-to-day basis, as a leader, that is out of your control. So it comes down to, I think, looking as well as the things I've just said, thinking about how we can ensure people feel that they are developing, they are good, and they are getting fulfillment, and they are making a difference, and they are enjoying doing what they're doing. So how do you do that? Because I think if you do that, my experience is if you do that and you create those conditions, the chances are not only are you going to retain people that are working for you, but you are also going to be able to recruit people. So I think that is absolutely around building a culture. And Mark and Evelyn have mentioned this word culture. And I think it was interesting. And you said, I think you gave a Drucker quote, was it culture eats strategy for breakfast?
That's it, yeah.
Yeah, well, culture does eat strategy for breakfast, but you better have a good strategy, because without a strategy, you don't get the three things that I absolutely bang on about all the time in terms of creating the conditions under which people are going to want to come and work for you. And that is simplicity, clarity, and consistency. And they come, those three things, regardless of what you're doing, regardless of what sector you're working in, what phase, special ed, primary, secondary, doesn't matter. If you bring in what you do as a leader, a sense of simplicity, clarity, and consistency, people will want to come and work for you. I promise you. That's your mantra. So my advice to you is slightly indirectly related to recruitment and retention. Whatever your discussion you're having with your subject teams or with your school as a head teacher or with your trust leadership team, have a bit of paper somewhere in the room that says simplicity, clarity, consistency. And at any time, anybody in that meeting can point to that bit of paper and say, lack of simplicity, lack of clarity, lack of consistency. And that drives culture and should drive the strategies that you put in place. So what's your offer? Let's just talk for a couple of minutes about, well, I share you our offer in our organization, and it's slightly nuanced for primary. I'll focus on secondary, but very similar things apply across both. So if I was kind of selling my wares as an organization leader and trying to get people to come and work for me, I can genuinely say for our secondary schools that we guarantee a disruption-free classroom. We guarantee that behavior, where there is challenging behavior, it will be dealt with centrally and it will be dealt with by the leadership teams in our schools. We guarantee that there will be a shared curriculum, that you won't have to go back to scratch on curriculum planning, and you will be able to adopt, adapt, or advance that curriculum. We value your input into it. We guarantee that there'll be shared planning, so it won't be planning every lesson every time you teach it. What I want my teachers to do, and this is what we say explicitly, is focus on those 15 or 20 minute, sometimes not even that, explanations in lessons. That's what I want you to focus on, not everything else. That's the craft of teaching for us. No meetings, no marking, professional development, no lesson observations, low stakes, incremental coaching, guaranteed to improve everybody. Wider opportunities for people, and in every single one of my schools, every single one, we employ a director of fun, not just for the children, but also to ensure that the teachers feel a sense of fun. Now, you put that list on a bit of paper and say, that's what you'll get if you come and work for us. The chances are you'll improve the chances of people wanting to come and work for you. So I think the offer is an important one, and that is related to what Mark and what Evelyn was saying about culture, and I would argue around simplicity, clarity, and consistency. So what makes people attracted to organizations ultimately is what I've just described, but also people. And it was interesting, I can't remember who said this, whether it was Evelyn or Mark, about, I think it might have been Evelyn, who was saying sometimes there can be a challenge where you advertise and sometimes people just don't turn up for the interview, or sometimes they don't turn up for the job. And what we found that, and how frustrating is that, what we've got, it's the same principle as recruiting sixth formers, incidentally, into your sixth form. If they're coming externally, the moment you get them on the latch, you regularly communicate with them, if necessarily every day or certainly every week. So you've already got a relationship with them by the time they turn up in your school. And we found that knocks 75% of those challenges on the head, and also works for recruiting external sixth formers. So that's just a bit about the culture and the offer that we make. But there's something else as well, and I think this is around reputation. You know, Mark and Evelyn have got fantastic reputations in our, and Ben, you'll excuse me, I know less about you. I know more about Mark and Evelyn. I'll know more about you in a minute, Ben, but they've got great reputations, and that reputation is really important. People want to work for people who have good values, who have good drive, and ultimately are successful in that sphere. And both Mark and Evelyn have a reputation for that. And so reputation does matter. So how do you maximize your reputation? I'm a big believer in, most problems can be solved with a cup of tea and a bit of humility. And the humility is really important. I think the humility bit is us just stepping back a little bit and allowing the people in our organizations to demonstrate what we are and develop our reputation. How do you actually do that? Well, if you are lucky enough, as I hope most of you are in due course, to lead organizations, schools or trusts, be outward facing. And this has a direct impact on your ability to recruit and retain. Be outward facing. Do not be limited by the boundaries of the schools or school that you are responsible for. Mark and Evelyn are living proof of that. So be outward facing. And that means connectivity, deliberate collaboration. Mark talked about collaboration being important. I don't like collaboration for the sake of collaboration. I like collaboration that is deliberate and purposeful. If you put those two, I think they're adjectives, deliberate and purposeful collaboration together, people will want to be a part of that. Secondly, opportunities for your staff and your organizations to influence the wider system. Again, like Mark, like Evelyn, like their schools, they are system leaders. We like to think we are. I think we are sometimes. We are system leaders. And people like to work for organizations where they have an influence beyond the walls of their immediate organizations. And then the final thing I would say is about being part of bigger things. Not, my trustees always say, we don't grow as a trust for the sake of growing. We don't grow because we want to be bigger. We grow as a trust because we want to be influenced more by other people coming into the organization. I want people to challenge me. And if you create a culture where people can do that, they really develop a sense of belonging, and then they tend to stay with you. And I think they're my reflections. So I hope that's just, I don't know how close to my 10 minutes I am, Ant, but they're my reflections. And if any of you want any of our policies related to any of those things I've said, or want to kind of discuss any of that more, feel free to get in touch with me privately. But I've enjoyed just sharing a few words with you this afternoon.
Yeah, no, thank you, Will. That's really, really interesting, and I just get lost in it. So I'm sure somebody in the background would tell me if you were over. Somebody would prompt me to interrupt, but I was really enjoying that. So no, it's around about the 10 minutes, which is great. Thank you so much. So much said with all three speakers. So much is being said in that condensed 10 minutes. It's amazing, actually, how much can come across to participants. So let's start at the very beginning here. No marking and no meetings have gone to the roof. We need to say that to begin with, in terms of retention strategy. So that might be something for later that we can touch upon in terms of operationally how that works. But that is something that's gained traction, that has essentially almost set fire to the Q&A there, that people don't have marking and meetings. And somebody that's in charge of fun, which is tremendous. Your concept of simplicity, clarity, and consistency, I think I captured that correctly. Well, that's again something that kind of really triggered with people. That was really interesting. And overall themes of that kind of collaborative theme, again, not for the sake of it, and not just kind of collaborating because you're all around the table together. I know in another talk, Mark, you talk about interdependence of organizations, which perhaps is something we can pick up on later. That's a really interesting thing that I talk about in other deliveries now, and that's sort of really picked up as well. And then there's just another question sort of operationally on how do you have a director of fun. That's kind of sort of ticked everybody's boxes as well, I think, which we can perhaps have a little look at later as well. So thank you very much for that, Will. Excellent as always. And now we're going to move on to the fourth and final of our speakers today, Ben. Dr. Ben Dunn leads impact and evaluation for STEM learning, the UK's largest provider of STEM support for educators and young people. He's worked in research and evaluation for over 10 years and is responsible for assessing the quality and impact of STEM learning support and providing strategic guidance and direction for the organisation. Ben is passionate about undertaking robust research and evaluation, driving continuous improvement and improving outcomes for young people. He is an ONS accredited researcher and holds professional memberships with the Royal Statistical Society, Social Research Association and UK Evaluation Society. And I've been practicing that, so I can't believe I got through that without a glitch. There's a lot of consonants and a lot of parts of that. Ben, you're very, very welcome to join us today. Thank you for being here, and I'd like to hand over now and invite you to share your thoughts for us as part of our expert-led talks on teacher recruitment. Ben, welcome.
Thanks, Anne, and thanks to the other speakers as well for really engaging conversations. No meeting sounds incredibly attractive, Will. So yeah, I have to follow up with you on that one. As Ant said, thank you. I come from a slightly different perspective. So my background is research, strong focus on quantitative data, and I did want to run through a few things that kind of stood out to me and try and synthesize some of this information into hopefully a digestible format. In terms of STEM learning, for those who don't know who STEM learning are, we predominantly run teacher professional development programs. We're not an ITT provider, so we're not really engaged in teacher recruitment, but we do run the curriculum hubs networks for science and computing, and to give you a sense of scale, we deliver about 50,000 days of teacher CPD each year. So the three things that I wanted to pull out, I think, one of the problems with going last in a panel like this is that, some of them might be repeated. So apologies for that, but I'll do my best not to repeat myself. The first one is the kind of recruitment figures versus those leaving the profession. And Mark and Evelyn have already spoken about the perfect storm. So back in June this year, Department for Education published the headlines from the latest school workforce census, and they accompanied it with this press release that was titled "Record Number of Teachers in England's Schools," and that kind of got my head scratching a bit. And I thought, hang on, everybody that I talked to, and the reason we've got 700 people here is because there is a real crisis in terms of recruitment and retention. So the title of this press release really kind of struck me, and I spent a few minutes just sort of unpicking some of the data here. There are a record number of FTE teachers in the profession, and this year we saw an additional 48,000 joined, which is up about 2,800 on last year, giving us a total of 468,000 FTE equivalent teachers in the profession, and that's the number that DFE put front and center of the press release. But one thing that it doesn't really mention is that there are also 44,000 teachers leaving the profession. So 48,000 joining, 44,000 leaving gives you obviously a surplus of about 4,000. And the thing that really stood out to me for the 44,000 that are leaving is that 40,000 of them are out of service. So 40,000 are choosing to leave. There's 4,000 that are retiring, and there's sadly a handful of teachers who die in service, but the majority of them, 40,000, are choosing to leave the profession. And this is actually a record number. There's a record number of teachers choosing to leave the profession, up almost a third on last year. What we also saw from the school workforce census is a record number of vacancies, which I think we've already heard a little bit about, and a 52% increase in temporary filled posts for classroom teachers. So that gives you a bit of a overview of the kind of school workforce census data that was published earlier in the summer. And ultimately, when we're talking about these numbers, we're talking about the total number of teachers. And there wasn't anything there that addresses anything subject specific, and perhaps working in STEM, we hear a lot about the challenges in science, the challenges in computing, and I wondered whether the recruitment issues are kind of more prevalent, more STEM specific, or whether this is something that's sector wide. So had a bit of a look at the recruitment targets for postgraduate ITT. DFE hit 71% of their target, and I think Evelyn said earlier, primary did pretty well. They achieved 93% of the target, whereas secondary down at 59%. So to put that in context, the DFE wanted 21,000 secondary teachers recruited last year, and they managed 12,000, which gives you a sense of the kind of scale of the shortage. And STEM subjects were down at 54%, including physics meeting 17% of the target. So about 500 physics teachers entering the profession, when really we wanted about 2,500. We also see low numbers for D&T, we see low numbers for computing, we see low numbers for modern foreign languages, but ultimately lots and lots of subjects are not meeting their recruitment targets. And so I felt like maybe this isn't STEM specific, then actually 62% of the recruitment target for EBAC subjects was met. So not even 2/3 in this case. And that kind of solved my issue, I guess. One of the reasons I went into this kind of deep dive into the data was to understand why they've put this title of the press release that a record number of teachers are in England's schools, when all I hear about is people leaving in the retention crisis. But to summarize, there are indeed a record number of teachers in their profession, but this sits alongside the fact that recruitment targets aren't being met, and some subjects are suffering worse than others. And even though, you know, arguably there are enough teachers, the fact that attrition is pretty phenomenal. So whether that's as I say, the record number of teachers who are out of service and choosing to leave the profession, or those record numbers that are in temporary roles in the classroom, it really isn't helping us to build a stable and effective workforce. So that brings me on to my second point, which is about the kind of retention rates and experience versus teaching outcomes. So we know retention rates have worsened since last year. Teachers are staying in the profession for less than previously. And the DFE stats show us that a quarter of new teachers leave within the first 3 years and a third leave within the first 5 years. And it's not just these kind of teachers who are new to the profession. Some research from the NEU shows us that that they did a survey of around 18,000 members, and 16% plan to leave within 2 years and 41% plan to leave within 5 years. And I think Evelyn mentioned some numbers from Teacher Tap as well, that kind of similar amounts. And it's not just the teachers either. Actually, 23% of support staff plan to leave within a couple of years and 48% within 5 years. That's almost half of the workforce planning to leave within 5 years, which is just astonishing. And when we think about teaching outcomes, I'm sure, you know, a lot of people here will be familiar with this Kraft and Pape graph that shows the kind of performance gains over teacher experience. And there's a whole body of literature really that suggests most of the performance gains in terms of teaching outcomes occur within the first 3 to 5 years or so. And it's not really until that sort of 3 to 5 year point that teachers hit the kind of peak performance. So when you consider that, you know, almost half of your teachers are going to be leaving within, or half of your support staff are going to be leaving within 5 years, and a third of your new teachers are going to be leaving within 5 years, really starts to show you those kind of effects that's going to have on teaching outcomes as well, where teachers aren't really in a position, they're not staying long enough in the position to reach their kind of peak effectiveness. There's also the issue of non-specialists. You know, when you're not recruiting enough teachers into the profession, you've got people who are teaching out of subject. Evelyn mentioned the 4 long-term unfilled science vacancies that you've suffered with. And I did a bit of a deep dive into the school workforce census just to have a look at you know, how kind of prevalent this is. And what we saw that is around 40% of physics is being taught by a specialist, compared to 50% of chemistry and 60% of biology. So even in the subjects like biology, where you're seeing pretty good recruitment numbers, the young people aren't being taught by a specialist, and that brings its own challenges in terms of the outcomes for the young people as well as the challenges that it brings for the non-specialist teacher having to teach out of subject. So that was my second point, that the retention aligned to the teaching outcomes and the experience is difficult. And then the third point I wanted to make was around the kind of reasons for leaving and the support to stay. And I think we've heard a little bit about this from some of the other panel members. The NEU, again, they did this survey, as I say, of about 18,000 members, and the top one was pay. Top reason for leaving is pay. Now this was done before the industrial action was resolved with the DFE. This was done back in about February, I think. So top reason for leaving is pay, but there's also some real significant reasons in there in terms of lack of career progression, the workload, which has been mentioned, the worsening pupil behaviour, which we've seen post-pandemic, and also lack of flexible working conditions. When you see your peers who are able to perhaps work remotely or work in hybrid roles. And what's being done about this? Well, you know, I'm sure some of you were at the Confederation of Schools Trust conference last week, as I was, and I was sat in the audience listening to Gillian Keegan talk about the DFE's workload reduction task force and their aim to reduce the working hours for teachers and leaders by 5 hours per week in the next 3 years. But what that doesn't account for me is the fact that, you know, post-pandemic schools are more and more becoming these sort of community hubs. And actually, it's not just the kind of workload around the marking and the teaching, and actually that whole kind of pastoral element as well has hugely increased. And the example earlier of helping young people to brush their teeth is a prime example of that. The DfE do have a flexible working policy, but you know, it is due to be updated in September 22, and we've not heard anything, and it's now October 2023. So, you know, it's difficult to know how we're meant to implement that as schools and trusts, and how we're meant to do that effectively. But there are some good things, you know, supporting career progression outside the traditional routes. And I think trusts, particularly multi-academy trusts, are in a really good position to do this. And, you know, we work with teachers and try and make them kind of expert professional development leaders, or we could have people in a kind of lead mentoring role. So it doesn't just have to be your sort of traditional routes into career progression, which actually sort of leave you with less time in the classroom, which is ultimately the thing why you've entered the profession in the first place. And then I think additional support mechanisms as well in place for teachers. So both financial and time as well to access professional development and perhaps access mentoring, and not just for ECTs, but making that available to all teachers would be really beneficial. We see, you know, obviously with my background and working at STEM learning, you know, we do lots of research and evaluation into understanding the impact of effective professional development and the positive outcomes that can lead to. And we see that, you know, that improves collaboration and sharing and well-being of teachers as well. A particular challenge for science teachers and perhaps some other subjects as well is that often the individual feels like they're kind of missing out on that cutting edge aspect of their subject. You know, you can teach up to Key Stage 5, but actually when you see the peers that you did your physics degree with, for example, going on to complete a PhD and really be at the sort of forefront, cutting edge of physics, people feel like they're missing out on that if they go to be a teacher and teach the, you know, quite rigidly the national curriculum, for example. So professional development can help us to reconnect with our subject as well, perhaps giving us some time out of the classroom, giving us some time, perhaps fostering a relationship with a local HEI. And then the last thing for me is some work that we did on kind of retention. So we had a look at the data and saw that those people that had engaged with professional development, subject specific professional development, were 150% more likely to remain in the profession the following year. And I think the thing with me is that correlation doesn't imply causation there. Okay, so that's just a relationship, and we're not necessarily saying that it's the CPD that's kept them in the profession. But for me, it comes back to culture, and everybody's mentioned this word culture. If you're working in a school, if you're working in a trust where you feel supported, you're given space to grow, you've got some autonomy, you've got some time to invest in yourself and invest in your own career development, you're probably less likely to leave your role. So I think that word culture there is really kind of fundamental in terms of supporting teachers to be retained in the profession. I'll end there and then hand back over to you.
Oh, lovely. Well, I was enjoying. Thank you very much, Ben. No, that was really, really interesting, really insightful, and another perspective. It's lovely, all the variety of perspectives that we're getting at the talk today. That's really wonderful, really interesting. And again, lots of comments coming up following your words there, Ben. Really interesting. The kind of the three stages you talked us through there. People were really interested in that kind of layered approach. So that was really interesting. We've had some comment about meaningful retention as well. In your comment about retention aligned to outcomes, etc. People are interested in that. Maybe some comments from us as we move into our kind of Q&A on the concept of some retention people being retained, people staying in the profession because they can't leave, because they actually are unable to go to alternative routes, and some leaving. I think it was back to Mark's point at the start, wasn't it, where we were saying that we're not necessarily looking at it as a lifelong career. People are coming in with intent. Some perhaps are not leaving because of burnout or because of low pay, etc. It's part of their professional strategy. They're working in education for X number of years, and then they're going to go on and do something different. So that the emphasis on meaningful retention, what do we mean by that, which was, so that was interesting. Yeah, I'm bringing this back down to kind of collaboration and culture again. I'm going to bring in my Branson quote, and I've waited until the end to say, you know, the temptation was strong earlier about the I think it's Branson that's accredited with saying train people so well that they can leave. And that concept, and I had that mindset, train people so well that they can actually, and they are prepared for working outside, I think, crucially, outside of education, and they're not restricted by just doing something that's very narrowly focused. And then the end of the quote is, however, treat them so well that they don't want to leave. And I just like that. That's just a little kind of summary there. Branson, it's quite Marmite in terms of the quote, but there we go, something to put out there, I think. So thank you very much to all four of our speakers, to Mark, Evelyn, Will and Ben. We're going to move in now. We have got sort of, I would say, 20 minutes before we would need to wrap things up before the end of the session. So there's been some themes coming out and I'll just kind of turn perhaps to kind of table the question. I'm thinking we might have time for 4 broad themes here with some responses. We obviously, forgive me panelists, we obviously will have to keep the answers quite succinct here in terms of timing. So just a thought around financial constraints. So that's come through as a significant theme. Financial constraints coming through, impact on staff numbers, support staff pay, the subsequent impact on the quality of staff that are being attracted. An interesting point being made about a potential use of apprenticeship levy funding, for example, could be interesting point about having creative recruitment strategies and being outward facing, potentially going to universities because there's potential, think about the school direct salary stopping, etc. So for example, some kind of use of the apprenticeship levy to undertake an apprenticeship ITT, which as it happens, best practice does offer, if anybody's interested in finding out more about that. And that would therefore be a fully funded way into teaching then, which might be of interest. People can ask about that. So I would open that up initially then to Mark. Do you mind if I just turn to you in terms of your thoughts, and I'll draw on each of you perhaps for the 4 questions to kind of lead on other questions. Mark, any thoughts there? Any reflections?
Certainly, the levy we use that a lot for a lot of different roles actually in the school, and that apprenticeship route I think is really quite important. Another thing which I should have mentioned earlier, but we have a so quite often you get somebody who comes to you and says, like, I'll give an example. I had somebody last year who was married. He came with his wife, both worked for the trust, and said they want to go to Dubai because they want to buy a house in 2 years' time. It was as simple as that, as straightforward as that. So we maintain their contract. We promised them a job in 2 years, and we do that quite often, as long as, you know, obviously we think they've a lot of potential, etc. So quite often that's happened with us over the last 5 or 6 years, where we've maintained, and not obviously you just promised them the job coming back. And it goes back to what I said earlier around, if the culture of the trust is okay, it doesn't really matter what school it is, you know, and we've got a very contextually very different schools as well. But so that's an idea of sort of, you know, when you've got somebody you really don't want to leave. I think there's a good point actually. Ben was saying actually, one part I've always said as a head teacher, like when you get deputies, your job is to move them on, isn't it? Really, and actually that reassurance that you will promote somebody's career by great CPD, great modelling and mentoring, etc., in order for them to contribute beyond your immediate school or your immediate trust, is part of this journey, isn't it? But certainly, I think you're right. I think the financial things are difficult, and obviously, and different trusts have different ways of doing it. But it goes back a little bit to, and the last thing I'll say is to Will said, and I noticed a lot of comments about the meetings. Well, to my mind, that's about really understanding whether a meeting is actually necessary or useful or effective. And I don't know about you, but I hate meetings. I've always hated meetings because, you know, quite often you could just read for 80% of the things that come out in a meeting. So I used to introduce something called meetings about learning, called MALs. So it was basically professional development. They're the only meetings you really want if you're going to have meetings. The other things can be done by other ways. And so that's the sort of thing. If you generate that interest of a teacher and the love of teaching, etc., that's where that comes from, by providing the opportunity for them to talk about pedagogy, to share pedagogy, to listen to others, you know. So that's the cultural aspect that we said about attracting people to maintain their interest in teaching and learning in your school or your trust.
Yeah, interesting point. Thank you, Mark. I mean, Will, did you want to come back on that in terms of any comments on that one?
I mean, yeah, I mean, I suppose fundamentally the question that you asked at the beginning was about funding at the start of your question. And, you know, whatever people's political beliefs, the priority of the current government has been to front load the formation of multi-academy trusts. You know, I suppose I would say that, but the bottom line is that's the political vehicle for creating efficiencies in the sector at the moment. And I'm not asking people to align their views with that or not align their views with that. It's just a fact. And we're able, you know, for example, as a result of some of the efficiencies we are able to get across kind of 30 plus schools, we can be creative with the appointments. So I can over appoint and knowing that I'm going to need people in a cluster of schools in Gloucestershire, South Gloucestershire, Berkshire, South London, Plymouth. I can over appoint, and then I've got people who can fulfill vacancies when I know they're going to arrive. You know, my what I'm seeing is around the funding. If you're in a small primary school, and I know a number of people are because I think they've made those messages, find a mat that gag pulls. That's the broader message that I'm hearing at the moment around the funding mechanisms. I'm increasingly coming up with primary schools who are interested in joining. And then when we say, well, actually, we reserve pull, but we don't gag pull, and for the benefit of people who don't know what that is, all the money comes into one pot and then it's allocated out to individual schools based on cost and managed by the trust. You're in a better position when you're a smaller primary school. And that's, I think, an answer to a few of the questions that came up, Ant. But yeah, I'm afraid bigger is more efficient and is more opportunities in this particular example.
Yeah, interesting point. Thank you both for that. Will, I might come back to you because we're getting a lot of talk about this no observations, no marking, no meetings thing, but I want to kind of ask a few other pointers. So, Evelyn, would you mind if I came to you next? Just some thoughts, some comments on data between potential differences between primary and secondary school successes. Perhaps that's something that you can take from me there. Can one learn from the other, perhaps? Are there any kind of creative ways? Somebody has turned around and said, how are you a brave and risk-taking leader in the current climate? I think that's an interesting kind of question. How would you make those brave and possibly risky decisions in terms of retention and recruitment? Any kind of thoughts there?
Yeah, I you know, it's not an easy one, but I think I always used to go back to my why. Why am I doing this? And if we can remember why we're doing it, then that brave and courageous leadership can kind of carry you forward in order to kind of do that. I'm not saying it's easy at all. I really am not. I do think that connections, relationships and partnerships, I think, are super important in helping you kind of become that kind of brave and courageous leader. So kind of building your kind of networks around you, I think, are helpful. I think, you know, I'm not a primary specialist at all, but just kind of looking at the work that Teacher Tap did, they talk about the difference between primary and secondary shortages, and they talk to the point that there's a declining pupil numbers in primary schools, and therefore the demand for teachers could be less. But I'm not the primary specialist on that, but I can see that, you know, I can see that with falling roles that you'd require less teachers, obviously. And you know, I used to think, but I've definitely changed my mind, and maybe Mark and Will can kind of talk to this point as well. I used to think that lots of the behavior challenges were mainly kind of or came up to secondary, but the more I talk to primary colleagues and TAs in particular, they're saying that the undiagnosed need in primary is growing and the behavior challenges are also growing. So whether that number tips over time, I'm not sure about that. Can I just give an example of brave and courageous leadership that also talks to Will's point around no marking and no meetings, kind of jumping around a bit here, but I just want to kind of tie that one up. So what we did at Coptal was we looked at our school day, because I agree around the number of meetings and meetings for meeting's sake that just, would kind of people would think, oh, why am I sitting here at the end of a long day, blah, blah, blah. And it didn't kind of feel very purposeful. So we changed our school day so that we kind of put all our meetings every other Wednesday. So school would close at 1:30 every other Wednesday, and all our CPD, all our learning takes place from 1:30 to 4:30. It enables that collaboration across the school. It enables staff to go out to other schools, and it enabled people to come in and deliver across a number of teams. It also spoke to well-being, because in changing the school day, we actually created a 2-week half term. So it gave a nod to well-being, gave a nod to CPD, and took away, trying to think, how can I support my staff? How can I get them? How can I retain them? And a bit of a kind of a recruitment tool. And feedback has unanimously really, really positive. And I do think that kind of takes a bit of bravery. You kind of got to be courageous, you kind of got to get all stakeholders involved. But in doing that, actually, we were really able to have a real lens on quality CPD, as opposed to bolting it on at the end of kind of meetings. We tended to bake it in to the life of the school. So I've kind of gone around a bit, but I've kind of touched on a few points there. Hope that was helpful.
Yeah, no, it is. It's interesting, yeah, particularly that courageous. There's a lot of talk and a lot of interest in that. How do you take those risks? If you, depending on, you could be in a significant size mat, as Will is there with the 30+ schools, etc. From a very small setting. It could be. We've had a lot of comments on Ofsted and external judgments being made. So if a school is seen to be in a vulnerable position because of its judgment, perhaps it's more challenging then to take those risks. If the school is very strong in its judgment, perhaps it is easier or less challenging, perhaps not easier. But thank you, Evelyn. That's enlightening. And Mark has put his hand up. Did you want to respond?
Just briefly, I think it's building on what Will and Evelyn has just said. I think we underestimate as leaders, and it's not radical. Well, I suppose it is a little bit, but it's not radical really. But you've got to think about your in-service days much more. Like we have 8. And I had 8 25 years ago, because nobody counts the damn things. So just go and do it. And actually, if I know that's more difficult probably in a local authority to maintain, but in a multi-academy trust, you've got to think. I used to have a quote: "What is the most important, the learning of a teacher or learning of a child?" And that's an interesting concept, because I think, and particularly I know it's quite radical because you're taking days off, but in disadvantaged communities, you need that real pedagogy in those schools, in every school, obviously. But that as a leader, think radically of how you can potentially utilize, and it doesn't have to be whole days. Evelyn just giving you a really good example of that. So think about how you utilize those days that you could do. And if need be, if you're in a trust, you go to the trustees and you say, I want 2 extra days. And actually, that's what we're going to do. Think about how you can actually utilize professional development, because that's what teachers want to do. They want to talk about teaching and learning. And ultimately, in my view, that's what improves things. So it's just a throwaway comment.
Yeah, interesting point here. Ben, just as I'm coming to you, so I was going to ask for statistics. That was one thing I was interested in. Are there any numbers? Evelyn referenced some in terms of primary and perhaps secondary and recruitment issues there. That was an interesting thing I was going to come to you with, as well as talk about points about international attracting. We've got people leaving the UK to go internationally, which I think is interesting. There's this perception of possibly that the pay is better overseas. So is it perception? Well, I've worked internationally, and it is definitely the case that it generally is better, etc. And you referenced that earlier in your delivery. So I just thought there was some invite around that. And of course, if you wish to reflect then on what Ben or what Mark and Evelyn have said, because you raised your hand as well. So over to you, Ben.
Yeah, thanks, Anne. I'll try and cover those quickly, given the
few
time.
left.
No problem. I just wanted to reflect on a couple of points that were made. You know, we kind of facilitate a school partnerships program at STEM Learning, and obviously part of my role is to sort of evaluate the impact of that. And I think one of the things that's really, really clear is that delivering those cross-school partnerships, particularly focused on transition, if you're talking about primaries and secondary schools working together, they only have impact when they've got the senior leadership buy-in. Okay, you can have the best infrastructure to deliver a partnership of professional development support and collaboration across the schools, but if you don't get the leadership buy-in, and then the knock-on effects of that are that the teachers see it as just an added thing to do. And therefore you don't get that impact on the young people. So as a role of the leader, I think the thing there is to allow that to happen where you can. Obviously, you're working within constraints. Kind of easy for me to say, isn't it? I think that the point about the sort of data as well, I don't have it off the top of my head. You'll be surprised to know, but I believe Evelyn's correct, and you're seeing reducing population numbers for young people at primary. And at the moment, that's not going to have a knock-on effect at secondary. We're actually seeing, I think, a 9% increase in the 16-year-olds last year. So that's one to bear in mind when we're looking at kind of uptake, and when we're seeing increased numbers of A-level students, for example. Well, we've got to pitch that against the fact that we've got an increased population at 16, but that sort of throughput of younger people at primary is reducing, and obviously will eventually reduce at secondary. So that again is something to bear in mind when we start to see a decline in uptake at A-levels and GCSEs. We need to bear in mind that that's partly driven by the population. And then the third point, I think, Ant, was about essentially people leaving the profession to go elsewhere. I don't have anything to hand that talks about internationally, but I think one of the really interesting things for me that comes through from the school workforce census that DFE publish is that it represents maintained schools, right? And so actually when a teacher leaves a maintained school and goes to work for an independent school, they're effectively left the profession. And I think that's something to be mindful of as well, because it doesn't necessarily mean that a teacher is leaving the profession of teaching. But in terms of the statistics that we're talking about, in terms of the way the DFE write about this, in terms of the challenges that we're talking about, they are kind of leaving the profession in inverted commas, but being mindful that if people are going to work in independent schools, then the message that's coming there is that they still want to be a teacher, they still want to be in teaching, and they're not leaving teaching because they don't want to be a teacher anymore. They're leaving it because they don't want to work in a maintained school, and for whatever reason they feel like there might be a more attractive proposition working in an independent school, or potentially internationally, as you say. I'll summarize there.
Yeah, no, that's an interesting point. Yeah, thank you, Ben. I'm sorry to put you on the spot with the statistics. That just thought you pull some numbers out of your sleeve. No, but that's really interesting, really insightful. Again, thank you very much for that. So we're close to the end, and I thought we've kept this, and we'll see if we can end on the solution of no marking, no meetings, and no observations. There are hundreds of people waiting on this answer, Will. So okay, so here we go. Let's hear it.
It was just a crude marketing strategy. They've all applied for jobs, and now you see.
Yeah, exactly. That's the best recruitment strategy.
Yeah. So basically, the trust's been going for nearly 10 years. So we sat down, must have been 7-8 years ago. We spoke to dozens of teachers, and we said, okay, what are the things that are stopping you being more effective? And they said hundreds of things, but 3 came up. 1 was having to manage behavior in their classrooms on a daily basis. 2 was taking piles of books home and putting marks in them. And 3 was attending unnecessary meetings, or indeed any meetings to a certain extent, depending on their level. And so we took that because I trust people. I work in an organization where we start from the point of view that we trust people. If they give me reason not to trust them, then I don't trust them, but most people do. And if you trust them from the outset, people live up to those expectations. So when we ask our teachers what will help, we trust that will help. So we centralize behavior, very straightforward. And I don't need to go into that. If you want to look at our behavior policies, they're all over the websites of any of our schools. People can follow those. Markings and meetings. So do teachers come together for professional development? 100% they do. We don't, that's not a meeting. That is a core entitlement of every teacher in our organization. And I'll link that into no lesson observations. And I'm looking at the time, so I've got a minute left. No lesson observations, but every single teacher in our school has a 10 or 15 minute visit. They know when they're coming from senior leaders in our school that come in, low stakes, no threat, not related to capability or discipline or anything else at all, not policy related. And they simply come in and spot fab stuff and leave them with one small actionable step, incremental coaching that they can do to improve. And we define a small step by something they can practice immediately. And teachers get annoyed when that doesn't happen in our organization. So we call it DDIs, developmental drop-ins, but it is literally every teacher every 2 weeks has a short developmental drop-in, and it is really powerful. And we have, again, the policies for that on our site. So the marking side of things, you know, if you want your teachers going home with piles of books and putting marks in them, does that make a difference? I'm sure you could probably find, whether it be correlation or causation, some kind of relationship between hours of time spent marking books and the quality of the outcomes. We found very little relationship between the two. Very little at all. And actually the feedback that I want my teachers to get largely comes from looking at what the children do in lessons, from use of mini whiteboards, from high quality questioning and other pedagogical strategies, and that helps them shape and craft their explanations. So I do not want them marking reams of books. Do they mark formal assessments a couple of 3 times a year? Yeah, sure they do. Of course they do. And they get feedback from that, but they do not mark religiously every week all their books. And to a certain extent, although it's slightly different, it's the same for our primary teachers as well. So we have a mantra. We want our teachers and our leaders doing things that are high leverage and create the best possible outcomes. So with no, I mean, it just does sound a bit like a sales pitch. Centralized behavior, no marking, no meetings that take place in our school. Of our 13 secondary schools, over half of them have got a P8 score over 0.5, and all of them bar one will be over 0 this year. And that is not because we've got a magic wand, it's because of simplicity, clarity and consistency, and that's how we do it. The other thing we say, Anthony, is every day is an open day in our trust, so if anybody ever wanted to visit one of our schools, people are always welcome. Look, 10 seconds before
Thank
the
you
end.
very much. Yeah, you're a good advert. I like you got the recruitment line in right at the end. Well done. That's interesting. No, so thank you very much. And it's really interesting, actually. It's really positive to hear tangibles when somebody makes a statement like that and puts something out in ether, and then they're asked, you know, what actually is happening, and you find actually there's nothing behind it. So it's interesting when asking the questions back to you today, everyone's coming back with tangibles, things that people can actually do, and there are answers to questions, as opposed to a redirect, which can often happen if you're having meetings with other organizations, that this is coming out with actual tangible real things that people can take on board. So thank you so much for that, Will, and of course everybody else from all 4 participants. I just would again like to formally thank Mark Davis, Evelyn Ford, Will Smith and Ben Dunn for their contributions today, and of course thank everybody else for sticking with us at the latter part of the evening today. Just to finish off, to say, just to remind you that the recording will be sent out with any resources, and we'll add some comments in because of time now today. We'll add some additional resources in. Comments have been made by one of the panelists about the apprenticeship levy and the use of that. We can share some information, etc. So do look out for that post this meeting, and also for participants to look out for your Cycle 1 expert talk. Your cycle is on ethical principles and leadership behaviours, so therefore it's going to be on the principles of leading improvement and how you can manage that within your setting. So do look out for that in your participant packs as you come on board and go through the programme. So once again, thank you very much on behalf of Best Practice Network to our panellists, to my colleagues who have been working very, very hard in the background, providing me with comments, and you all for joining us participants today. And I look forward to seeing you all again at the next expert-led talk. So we'll draw everything to a conclusion there and stop the recording. Thanks, everybody. Thanks very much for joining.